We will now be moving on to the legislator panel. I'd like to invite the legislators up here to join me. I do see two. I'm not quite sure if Senator Johnson is here yet, but I'm sure he'll be arriving here shortly. So we are starting a couple of minutes early, but we'll go ahead and get started, and when he arrives, he can join in on the conversation. So very excited today to introduce the next panel. We have two distinguished legislators joining us today, and a third will be joining us shortly. These gentlemen are heavily involved in groundwater issues at the Capitol, so we're delighted to be able to hear from them today and see what's on their mind concerning groundwater. So to my left, we have Senator Charles Perry of Lubbock. Senator Perry represents Senate District 28. He was first elected to the Senate back in 2014. Prior to that, he was in the House of Representatives starting in 2010. He currently chairs the Senate Committee on Water, Agriculture, and Rural Affairs and serves on several other very important committees in the Senate. Next to him, to his left, is Representative Stan Kitzman of Pattison. Representative Kitzman serves House District 85 and was elected to the House in 2023. So last year was his first year. Currently serves on the House Natural Resources Committee and the Agriculture and Livestock Committee. I also found this out when doing the research that he's a board member of our sister association, the Texas Water Conservation Association. So it's great to have that familiarity there. So it's really great. Again, we're honored to have you guys here today. These conversations with you guys are always a highlight of the summit. So we really appreciate you taking your time to come to San Antonio and share your thoughts with us. I'd like to start off today with kind of familiarizing our audience with you, your district, and your relationship to groundwater, what your passions are about groundwater. Then we'll spend a little bit of time talking about groundwater themes from last session, then dive into some interim stuff, what's been going on during the interim regarding groundwater, and then we'll shift the conversation to the upcoming legislator and kind of get your thoughts on what's going to be happening next session. So we'll start with you, Senator Perry. Your West Texas district is one of the largest Senate districts in the state, if not the largest, and includes many GCDs and overlies several important aquifers. Could you take a couple of minutes to share a bit about your district and the unique perspective it gives you on groundwater management?
Yeah, I'm the second largest Senate district now. I held that #1 spot for 10 years before redistricting. 41 counties today, 51 in the prior session. And the current first place is just to my south in Midland, Odessa. So combined, we're like 25% of the state's counties. Majority of my district sits over the Ogallala, the largest freshwater body pretty much in the country that extends multiple states. It's depleting. It's not fast recharging at any level. It is multi-state, and that presents challenges, and states to the north of us are beginning to look at their depletion rates and starting to talk about some type of permitting and how to go about limiting pulling from that. My understanding basically is it kind of splits, that it's not connected from Nebraska to Seminole, Texas, that there's a break in it, some tectonic shifts there. So it's really kind of two aquifers with one label. It's kind of my basic understanding. I have the DOCM, Santa Rosa, whatever you want to nomenclature changes on it, but heavily dependent on groundwater. We have limited surface water availability. It is a challenge for us. There is two significant planned depletions, if you will, to meet the state water planning. And South and North Plains is one area, and the Valley is the other area. Specifically, the irrigated crop production in those areas. Our current state water plan assumes that they're going to actually pull at 30% less than they are today, which is absolutely unconscionable and irresponsible. We do have other options, and when we talk about legislative session and what I've been focusing on in the interim. We'll get into a little bit more granularity there. We produce, I think, 25% of the cotton in the country, maybe the world, out of that area. We have cotton, corn, grains, sorghums, and cattle, heavy ag influence. And the state would look differently if we lose an agricultural industry. So it's my job to prevent that from happening. We do have viable options not to. As far as the state goes, I've been working across state boundaries and in the state to figure out what are our water options for the Texas as a whole. This interim, I've had some international conversations, so we're chasing water and what is best practices around the world to try to implement in Texas going forward. So it's been a busy interim. District is rural. I think in my 51 counties, I can state 38 of my 51 were less than 10,000 people. So most of the folks in here come from those areas, and they're my peeps. Water districts play a vital role over permitting and trying to extend, if you will, the existing resources. I qualify that it's extension and not creation. We have to talk in ways of new creation of new supply development, or we're not going to make it in Texas. So that's been my focus, is new water supply development. But water districts play a vital role in taking what we have and extending it the best they can. Untenable task. We're not always on the same page in some areas, but I do appreciate the task that they've been given by the legislature to effectively try to manage the scientific data underneath the surface water that we have become very much too dependent on. Yep. And I see my colleague coming in from the Senate. We started without you, but not because we didn't love you. It was just early. I tried to tell him, Johnson will be here. But I've been trained well. You're late to my hearings. It's good to see you, brother.
Thank you for that, Senator Perry. Yes, I was actually having a conversation with a gentleman from New Mexico last night, and we were talking about exactly that, what's going to happen when the Ogallala dries up and we're not going to be able to grow cotton in that area and other agricultural products. Like, what's that going to mean for not just the United States, but for the entire world? So that is definitely something to think about going forward. So, sorry to touch base, given an overview right now, Senator Perry started. But I'd like to ask you, Senator Johnson, you represent Senate District 16, excuse me, got to get my notes straight here. You got it exactly right. Which covers parts of Dallas. It does not have a groundwater conservation district, but you have been very active on groundwater issues throughout your time in office. Can you share a little bit about your district and how that shapes your views on groundwater?
I'd love to, but first I want to say this water committee, I was put on my first session, and maybe one of the first bills I got to handle came from chairman of that committee, Senator Charles Perry, and I've enjoyed serving on that committee and working with Senator Perry. It's a crucial issue for every single district, including mine, and it's also one of those topics that the regions of the state don't all have the same perspective, and it makes it difficult to manage. From the perspective specifically of my district, it is entirely dependent on surface water, not on groundwater. There was a reservoir built in the region fairly recently, but if you project out 30 years, which we need to do when we're talking about water, the population growth in my area is staggering, and it is not by any means certain that the needs of the human water consumption and the industrial water consumption will continue to be met by surface water. So I'm very interested in seeing that we look at alternative systems of water supply, including aquifer storage and recharge recovery systems that are going to be happening, presumably in my district, but other places around the state. I think that anything we do in an urban area has a little bit of an advantage because there's a larger tax base, a stronger impetus, and I'd like to see some projects developed in urban areas like the one that I represent, where the trial and error as we're developing new techniques, you can see costs down, you can see best practices developed that can then be exported to districts around the state. So I think there is a interdependency among the regions, whether they're rural or urban, agricultural or industrial. where we can all benefit from the perspectives. And part of our job as legislators is to manage those expectations and make people recognize the interdependence and the potential mutual benefits from what we're doing.
Thank you for that. Representative Kitzman, your district includes all or parts of 6 counties and includes 4 different GCDs and part of a subsidence district. It's predominantly rural, but as state's growing, more and more people are moving into your area. Could you tell us a bit about your district, and particularly in relation to groundwater?
I serve House District 85, which on the map is the 6 counties west of Harris County. So everything west of Houston, Waller, Austin, Fayette, Colorado, and Wharton counties, and then part of Fort Bend. So it is a mix of different worlds, all right. What was vastly agriculture just a few years ago, of course, is changing very much in the east, is Katy and eastern Waller County and Fort Bend County are changing very rapidly from rice fields to houses. And the demands on the water and what people expect are different. We have, of course, primarily my local groundwater conservation district that a few years ago was worried about a landfill or a project here and there, and now has to manage this urban growth versus continuing to support our agriculture enterprises. And of course, we all have to have a drink of water every day, but we also need something to eat. So protecting our agriculture, making sure that's still able to be taken care of from the water side is important in our district. But we also have an awful lot of new neighbors, and their expectations are a little bit different, but the problem is still the same. Where does that drop of water come from?
Absolutely. All right, well, I appreciate hearing from y'all on your views on groundwater, and as Senator Johnson mentioned, there is a lot of diversity on groundwater in the state, and so it's great to have the 3 of y'all up here, representing that diversity. Now I'd like to talk a little bit about last session. In a lot of ways, it was a true water session with some very important legislation passed. Senator Johnson, last session was your 3rd time to be on the Water, Agriculture, and Rural Affairs Committee. Looking back at that session, what do you see as the most significant accomplishment in groundwater policy?
I think the biggest just starts with the big dollar allocation. We did put $1 billion towards development of new water resources, and I'll get to a minute on why I think that was insufficient. Some of the less noticed bills, and I'm pretty sure one of them was Chairman's here, to require all new subdivisions being built to certify that there's an adequate groundwater supply. I think it's not the first thing we've done to make sure that we're thinking about the issue, but I think we've had the luxury historically of not worrying about it, and we're no longer there. And I'll note that recently in Arizona, the governor had to, by executive decree, block any new subdivisions that relied on groundwater, even though they had laws in place like the one we passed. So I'm interested to see how that bill is implemented to make sure that it actually performs the function. Now, as far as money that we spent, I think it was insufficient. And I think maybe we'll talk about this later, so I'll get to it in detail later. But I think it was hugely significant that we took the big step, but particularly given the size of the balance last session and going into next session, I think we need to do more.
Yes, absolutely, I think. Senator Perry, a lot of the legislation that was passed, you are basically spearheading most of it. Do you see any shortcomings or missed opportunities from last session?
Well, as always, you pass it, then the rules get promulgated, and then you find out the loopholes you didn't catch. So 2440 specifically is going to have some tweaks to it that will tighten up my intention, which is solely 100% if a couple's going to put their life savings into a 30-year mortgageable property, they need to know with certainty that there's 30 years of water supply underneath it. So that is typically not happening, I would say, 100%. There's always those guys that get cute. And to my development community, I had told them on the front end, I'm serious about making sure people have certainty of water supply if they're investing in their life savings. So we're going to go back to 2440, close the loopholes, tweak some of the conversations. There was some interaction with a different bill, totally unrelated, that we crossed over and kind of messed up some of the intent of one of those coming out of local government. So there's a couple of tweaks to 2440 specifically. Last session, we got to deal with several, I know this is a foreign concept to you guys, but groundwater districts tied up in litigation. That seems to be a new horizon that's going to be more and more and more of a reality to you guys because of the growth. I will tell you on the short term, there's some things the legislatures need to do specifically to some enforcement opportunities for people that overpump, that are wholesaling water out of districts. We're looking at those things in the next legislative session. But I say all that, say in the next conversation, you fix this by developing undeveloped water supplies, and you take the pressure off of all these cuteness and all these fun things that people are trying to do to find a new source of water when in reality they're just taking water. It's not a new source. So we're going to work on that. But the low-hanging fruit, if you will, I think the water districts have been set pretty much in statute for a long time. I think everybody understands them pretty well. I don't know that there's a whole lot to do. I will say that I believe in the last 3 months I've had the opportunity to interact with a particular district that decided to legislate from their board. We're going to clean that up. So we'll close some of those things. But all in all, last session was all about water funding, a conversation that we haven't had since 13 when we did SWIFT. But a different type of funding. And I will give kudos to the Water Development Board. The $750 million of the billion that we put into the, quote, leaky pipe funds was all put out on the street, so to speak, last, say, month. They were able to clear every backlog of project that was in-house at the Texas Water Development Board that were there for decades, but not due to lack of funding, were not implemented. So we just took out, I was told, all of the 1,000 connections and unders infrastructure needs with 46 million of that 750. 300 million went back to SWIFT to replenish it back to the $2 billion limit. And then the difference is going out as some grant and some loan opportunities to big cities, municipals, because we're losing about 140 billion gallons a year in leaky pipes. But to the legislature's credit, I told those that were asking, I said, this is a drop in the bucket, no pun intended. So the funding is by origin and by design meant to be replenished. So next session is we're going to actually look at the 250 for new water supply, and that's where my focus has been. But we did a good job. We had a lot of money, a lot of big priority spendings, a lot of bait-up demand. For the most part, I can argue that I wasn't excited about some of the things we did, but I think the legislature did try to focus on those things that we had left undone for too many years and put money towards it. So Water Development Board did exactly what I told them. I said, I can't ask for new money if you don't spend the old money. And the need is there. And to their credit, they were able to fill application and get it on the streets.
Thank you for that. And we will talk about funding a little later, but it's good to hear you say those things. Rep. Kitzman, you've been deeply involved in water industry for many years and have likely been in the audience, like everybody out here, numerous times at conferences, listening to legislators talk on panels and keynotes. I think that there's a lot of people in the audience here want to know what's it like being on the other side. Now that you're in the legislature, you're on the House Natural Resources Committee, what has it been like? You know, did anything surprise you? How difficult has it been or easy has it been, you know, with that background in water?
Well, I was fortunate enough to have been, I work with a water district every day. That's part of my real job. So I've had that exposure. I grew up, of course, watching water issues around our local area. To be able to be involved with TWCA and not only be on their board, but be a member and have that opportunity to increase my knowledge on that over the years, I thought was going to be a big asset to bring to the legislature, and I was very pleased to be placed on natural resources, which in the House side, that's water, if you don't know that. But I came in thinking that probably the legislature was not doing enough for water. And I want to say here, I appreciate Senator Perry's leadership from the Senate side and all the things that I got to participate in as a freshman. There really is something to being a freshman in the legislature. It's not quite as bad as being hazed at A&M as a freshman, but there is something to that, and then plus the learning curve that you have. It's one thing to come from the outside; it's another thing to actually participate. And I hope I was able to catch on to that pretty quick. On the House side, we had the leadership of Representative Tracy King as chairman of our committee, and I do believe there's not many people in the House that know more about Texas water than Tracy King does. So I considered it a great opportunity for me to get to learn from him, at least for one session. He's retiring and not going to be back. So what did I expect from the legislature? Was I surprised? I was surprised that more was being done than what I had imagined. Is that enough? I think I agree with the senator, not enough, and we've got plenty of work to do next session.
Yes, y'all do. And certainly, Tracy being gone, it's going to be a huge loss. I'd like to turn gears now and talk about the interim. Senator Perry, we'll start off with you. So Senate Water, Ag, and Rural Affairs Committee, there have been a few water-related interim charges, including water system reliability and monitoring of SB 28 and SB 1289 from last session. Your committee held a hearing back in May, and there's another hearing planned in a couple of weeks. Could you tell us about the issues raised by those charges, what your thoughts are on the May hearing, and what you expect from the hearing in a couple of weeks?
Well, the Lieutenant Governor was pretty gracious in that he gave me a very broad and wide interim charge, and that was by design to squeeze in a lot of related but not specific. Water's kind of a lot of different things, so in that vein, we took it pretty seriously, and we started the water conversation in a hearing setting. So in the first one, we had what are our options specifically. We had a produced water panel. We didn't talk a lot about some of the other options because they were kind of in the works. This next hearing in September, we ought to have not probably a granularity or specificity that I'd like to be at. It takes a little longer than a few months to design, but at the same time, we should be able to expand a little bit on where we're at in our, quote, water supply conversation and what Texas looks like going forward. The produced water was a full panel. We had experts there. For those that don't know it, produced water comes up with your oil and gas production every day. It's estimated 10 to 15 million barrels, 10 to 14 million barrels of water a day out of the Permian Basin. In connection with that day in the panel, we had what does the energy source for desal look like? And anybody that's heard me speak the last year, and I've been involved in it for longer than that, but the Small Modular Nuclear Reactor Project out of Abilene Christian University is the answer for not only the regional / lot-specific power source needed for desal, but just as much for fueling an oil and gas industry at 100-megawatt units. So it's been a very holistic approach to water supply development and conversations. Hopefully in September we'll be a little bit more broader on what we can talk about specifics that are kind of working through the system. But it was a very broad charge. And I asked for it to be something that I could squeeze in just about everything that's water related. But it ties over to the energy sector. It ties over to pipeline. It ties over to a whole lot of different things. So that's really what we produced was expert panels, and Water Development Board spoke. We also had a SWIFT update hearing, I believe. But we're going into flood planning hearing too, kind of now that the flood plan's been voted out in September. There's a lot of questions as we put up several $1 billion towards flooding, and we're still getting floods. But I think that just people need to understand that the complexities of making flood planning work is no different than roads and bridges and highways, our water infrastructure. So the September hearing will be long, but it'll be informative. I think it'll be a fairly detailed as much as possible. And I'm going to have some accountability. There has been some flood money spent that in regions and areas that I still to this day don't quite understand why we're still having the same flood event. So, we need to get clarity on where we're going with that. In that, I believe 3738 of the new flood plan has water supply attached to them. Where it makes sense, you can do water supply and flood planning together, and that was an emphasis of Senate Bill 8 when we did that, to make sure you don't overlook low-hanging fruit. To move water off somebody for the benefit of future use only makes sense. So a lot of good things are happening. The charges were broad. We had some good panels on what possible supply opportunities look like, specifically on produced water that day. We'll tighten it up as to where all of those initiatives are. Having the Water Development Board spent the $750 now, we'll get kind of hopefully a kind of an accounting of where those went and what projects look like and who it benefited. There was an emphasis on small connects, small rural taxing jurisdictions that no longer have a tax base that can support multi-million, much less billion-dollar projects. So it's going to be a good recap, I think, of what we did and hopefully propel us into the 25 session in January to have some legitimate funding conversations.
Great. Yeah, hearing about that, I was at that meeting and hearing about the technologies that they've got just on the energy side and the ability to treat that to like what the levels that they were talking about. I mean, it's amazing how well they can treat that water, right? Senator Johnson, what were your biggest takeaways from the hearing in May? And are there any other issues that you're involved with over the interim groundwater wise?
Yeah, I think what stood out to me most from the hearing is the importance of information. And we looked at a wealth of new information that we have, and we are also able to identify some places where we're lacking information and talk about systems where we can get more information. And that's actually something that I think we need to do more work on. One of the things I want to do next session, in fact, is to provide some funding for groundwater conservation districts to monitor the groundwater usage better so that, for example, if you have two districts sharing a single aquifer, they can cooperate better because they actually know what's going on. We're a little bit having to conduct this ground up, so to speak, regulation in the dark. So I thought it was illuminating to see the work that the Texas Water Development Board had been doing, as well as the districts. And just more information is always better, so we can make better decisions. It also highlighted the coming interdependence between water and electricity. And one of the things we explored a lot about was the amazing promise of molten salt nuclear reactors, particularly as paired in certain regions when we look at desal. And you see right there a very close potential relationship, but it's broader than that. And it also gets into this rural versus urban instead of a rural and urban where we have common issues. On the urban level and the rural level, we have an explosion of data centers, particularly the AI data centers that draw an enormous amount of electricity and put a strain on the grid and require generation. They also use a hell of a lot of water. And they're going to use water in urban areas, and they're going to use it in rural areas because they want to site where there is clean, cheap energy, which usually means solar panels and wind turbines. And they're going to be out where those areas happen to not have a whole lot of water, and they do have a whole lot of agriculture. So you have these simultaneous tensions between explosive demand and diminishing supply in both urban and rural areas. And the hearing kind of highlighted the connection between energy and water at a time when both paradigms over the last century, especially the last 20 years, have sort of fallen behind changes in industry and population growth patterns. And I think the whole regime has to be updated, and I don't know how. But that came up in the hearing, and I think we will continue to see that going in, the interconnectedness between energy markets and water use.
Great. Thank you for that. Representative Kitzman, I'd like to turn to you now and the House Natural Resources Committee. There are several groundwater-related interim charges, and as we heard earlier from Sarah, the first meeting is going to be sometime in September, late September. What do you see the focus on that hearing being, and what other issues are you looking to bring to the forefront during the interim?
We have not had our meeting yet, like you said. That's coming up. Unfortunately, I haven't seen a specific agenda for that meeting. I do know that one of our interim charges has to do with groundwater and looking at the districts, and it's my hope that we're going to spend a lot of time talking about that and getting ready for the next session. I wished I had something more to tell you, but that's kind of where we're sitting at the moment.
Is there anything that you would like to be brought up in that meeting?
Well, I think, one of the problems we have is I like the groundwater districts and local control, and you're responsible for your area. You know that best. And but at the same time, we've got to have some kind of coordination across the state. And as much as we don't like anybody from Washington coming to tell us what to do, I'm a little leery of somebody from Austin coming to tell us what to do. But in the end, we have a statewide problem with our water. The aquifers, they don't know where those lines are between groundwater districts or between counties. They just know that there's water down there and people are taking it. And so, having a coordinated plan, which is what Senator Perry's been working on, is important. The other thing that's a big issue for me is where we have the urban centers want to come out to the rural areas and they're able to buy water and take that back in enormous quantities, and that's the right of those property owners, all right, but it's a huge problem for those local communities. And again, as county commissioner, I kind of witnessed that firsthand, and we were able to work through it, and the municipalities had to find another source of water, but that is a big issue in rural Texas, and for the areas where people are going to be moving to perhaps limit the amount of water they can have available later on is going to be a problem. It might fix a problem right here today, but I don't know that it prepares those areas for the future. And so if we could find a way to talk about that some, I think that'd be pretty good.
And I think Representative raises a really important point there in that relationship between areas where urban areas are purchasing the water. And it's one reason I think that we ought to do some funding for urban areas to develop alternative sources, including aquifer storage and recovery. I know in my district there's a couple of hydrogeological formations, I love that word, that we can use to inject water into, but also storm runoff. I mean, roads are impermeable, enormous amounts of water go off, but it's a costly venture to start capturing that water, but I think we could be. And the more we can have these urban areas able to draw water from other sources, the less shopping they're going to go do in these rural areas where, great, we sold our water, but now we don't have any. And I don't. That's not a good scene for any of us.
Yes, absolutely.
It is a multifaceted solution. It's not just taking everything from the groundwater, or when it's going to take a combination, and I think that's what they've been working on. So.
Yep.
Can I highlight something else the representative said that's so important and has nothing to do with water except everything to do with water and everything else? He said it's one thing to come in from the outside and it's another thing to participate. And going into this session, I hope there's a lot of people who will remember that, because I sure appreciate that attitude on the Democratic side and the Republican side.
Thank you. Okay, now I'd like to turn our focus to the upcoming session. As y'all know, it's rapidly approaching. Start off with you, Senator Perry. For the last few years, you've been extremely passionate in leading the charge for the state to work on obtaining new water sources. Will you be continuing to work on that this session? Can you share your thoughts on any specific ideas that you have in mind, any technologies, anything that's come up recently? I know you shared a little bit earlier, but is there anything that you're going to be putting most of your focus on?
Yeah, so I'll try not to take too much, but so let's just give you a state of the current water plan. In the state water plan today, it acknowledges 7 million plus acre feet shortfall by the year 2070, I think it is. Let's just cut that to 50, because truthfully, we have woefully underestimated Texas' successes, and we're not going to hit those numbers. In that plan, if you're really doing an honest assessment, there are things that will never happen that we're banking on water. I can give you 4 reservoirs that we're supposed to be drawing water from 2020 that the 404 permit's not even been begun. So let's just set those aside. They're not happening. If they're happening, they're still 30, 40 years out. So an honest assessment of where we're at in our current plan that says we're 7 million known acre feet. And by the way, if everything in that plan happened, we would still be 2.4 million short. So we're really 9 if you're trying to cover the state's needs. And then when you start looking at it and going down the, quote, catch-all, And I'm not against the water plan. I don't want anybody to leave here and say it's bad to have a plan. We got a good plan, but it needs to be updated for reality we face in Texas in 2025. And it's not been done that in decades. I know every 5 years we check the box and send it in and say, we've got our water needs met, but guess what? If you look at what they've checked off of the boxes that's just become rote, there's reservoirs in there that won't be developed. And here's what I like the best, water management strategy. That's a catch-all for we don't have a clue, but we got to tell the state we're going to do this, so we're going to say we're going to change consumers' behavior so they don't use as much water in the future, therefore we'll meet our need. So if you're really honest, it's between 10 and 12 million acre feet of shortfall over the next 30 to 50 years. That's the honest assessment. And in some areas, probably 10, 20 years. So I've taken the plan and tried to hone in on what can we do. And here's the good news. This is absolute good news. I've identified, and people cringe when I say it, and especially some of the old water dogs, and I don't profess to be one. I'm not an expert, but what I do know is how to do math and how to do reading and how to do some research. In my feeble mind and CPA work, I've come up with about 109 million acre feet a year potential new supply. Now, in reality, recoverable is probably half of that, but we're still 50 million acre feet. Possible recovery of new supply development in Texas. We only need 10 to 12, and we don't need all that today. Here's what we can't do. The reason the water plant is not where it needs to be today is 100% unequivocally because it was not funded. We have put water at the doorstep of every local regional planning group's footprint, if you will, since the eternity of the plan, and we love ground up. We love local participation. But those projects are billion-dollar conversations now. There's no one taxing jurisdiction that's going to ever fund that water project. We have to change the dialogue from it's a local funding, local design, because one, it's inefficient, two, it's duplicative, and three, it doesn't solve regional needs at all. It solves a very strategic, siloed, one city, one problem area, short term, and we didn't expand any new supply. We're just taking it from one or the other. So it's time to have a conversation that water is no different than roads and bridges. It looks like it, it acts like it smells like it. We demand continuity and connectivity in our roads and bridges. We did that because back in 2009 or so, we had some leadership vision that said, in order for vendors to get excited about building out things that will work for the Texans of the future, we're going to commit state and we're going to give continuity in funding. We're going to give predictability so that we're not telling a vendor to sign up for 50-year projects, and guess what? Every 2 years we'll decide if there's money to pay you. So water's got to change that conversation. So the plan is going to be very simply, we need X number of acre feet over the next 30 to 50 years, some sooner than later. We have 4 new supply opportunities. There are 4 undeveloped opportunities in the state of Texas today. 3 of them are desal intense. Marine, produced water, and brackish. The other one is acquisition of surface water from someone other than someone that's already committed the water to the Texas. It's got to be some new supply. We have limited supply of uncommitted surface water in Texas. Best case scenario, 1 million feet. Best case of maybe politically achievable taking of water to move it. I've ventured that when that conversation starts, those representatives and senators in those areas are going to say, you can't touch my 1 million surface water. There's another 1 million outside the state in conversation that's legitimately there. 2 million acre feet of surface water availability in the best case scenario. The rest of it's made up of desal opportunities. My commitment to this group and everybody I've spoke for the last year, I've taken a holistic approach to water supply development in Texas that will get Texas in a conversation with industry groups today that says, we are working on your water problem and you can come knowing full well that we've got the solution and we're going to do it. We have to have continuity of funding. We have to have a jump start. These are engineering and planning and long-term in investment just to get it ready to do. But the valley's irrigated crops and agriculture production should not go away. Neither should the South Plains and North Plains, and then there should not be a county in Texas that doesn't have access to a pipeline that can bring water. For y'all's industry groups, if we find alternative sources to depleting a groundwater supply that y'all are having to go to court over permitting, we've solved y'all's world. Wouldn't it be nice to have a world to say, man, our aquifers are not depleting because the state has invested in money to develop or plant or alternatives to what we were doing, and we set this state on a path that there is really literally nothing, because we're going to fix the grid. It took an event or two. We're going to be there in 6 years. I tell people, this is what's interesting. If we have a flood, or we have a grid event, or a broadband connection problem, people in public outcry is immediate. You recognize it, you see what it is. And we deal with it. Sometimes we wish we'd been a little more forward-thinking and didn't have it, but we're here now. So I think we'll fix the grid in 6 years or so. We're going to have capacity built out. The small molecule reactors are part of that conversation. Water is death by 1,000 drips. And then when you realize you're on life support, it's 30 to 50 years to fix it. So the question today and for Texas in 25 is, are we proactive? Are we visionary? Are we going to commit leveraging those local conversations to where we literally have a water plan that works and not one that we talk about? And that's my energy, my focus. The cool thing is Texas has the wealth and the undeveloped supplies to solve this problem. It's one of the few things in the Texas legislature that does not have a broken family or a broken heart attached to it. It is it's just purely a commitment of resource to a vision to do it and bring smart people in a room to design it that it works.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. Rep. Kitzman, what solutions do you think we need to be looking at in regards to new water?
I didn't hear your question.
What solutions do you think we need to be looking at in regards to new water sources? Piggybacking off what Senator Perry said.
Well, and I want to, again, thank the senator for his comments. What I said earlier was we have to be looking for solutions, and that takes some coordination. To have somebody in the legislature or members of the legislature that are steady on course with the issue, that look at it over time instead of just in 2-year chunks is so important, and it makes a difference to have those people in those offices and on those committees where they can keep the rudder steady and point us down the road. Again, as far as sources, I think everything's on the table. It really is. Some are going to be good and others are going to be rejected. But produced water, my hometown, they used to make water makers there for oil rigs, and I realize that's one oil rig, not 6 million people in Houston. But what do we do with that technology? Can we clean that water, whether it's produced water or desal or whatever? We've got to do that, and we've got to make it economical. People tell me, well, overseas they have desalinization, and they've got petrodollars paying for it too. And how do we do it so the average Texan can still afford to get a drink of water? And that's the trick, and then it always comes back to money. And I agree with the senator. The state has to make those plans and those investments so we have a long-term program. And but whether it's figuring out what to do, produce water, why waste that water? We've talked about taking flood water and using that somehow. Of course, that's in some cases dirtier than produced water, but we have a way to clean that. We have a way to make it so that it can be potable. It can be used by people for their needs. Maybe some of what you do is different for irrigation than what you do to provide water for homes. I think that gets expensive though too when you got to have 2 sets of pipes going everywhere. But the programs we've been talking about, we've got to continue to investigate that and see how we can just make it economical enough for people to do it. The water's there in different forms. How do we make that so it takes care of our society?
Yeah.
We could spend hours and hours talking about price of water.
Right.
But
Well,
you have anything to add?
Yeah, maybe we should. I want to analogize this to the electricity space where I've done a lot of work the last few years. There's two sides of this equation. There's supply and there's demand. And I agree with the emphasis that Senator Perry and Kitzman are talking about in developing new water supplies, but simultaneously, we need to be looking at demand. It will continue to grow. Will it grow in the same proportion that it exists today? I hope not. And so that means we need to be looking at ways to reduce water loss, which again is an investment in infrastructure. We lose a lot of water, probably not 7 million acre feet, but we do need to start upgrading our infrastructure. These systems are aging. Texas Water Development Board has done a great job, and I think we ought to rely on them heavily and probably increase the funding there so that we can decrease the water loss. A gallon saved is a gallon earned. The second thing we need to do, which I don't know that we always do such a good job of in this state, we so zealously want to recruit every industry to come here. You got to give some foresight to what will be the effects that they have where they go. Do we have enough water to put a new AI data center plant right there? And so as we grow our industry, as we grow our commercial base, we need to do so thoughtfully in tandem with making sure that there's going to be enough electricity and enough water so that it doesn't create more of a problem. Great, 100 new jobs and we have no water. So I think that it's less fun to be thoughtful when you're talking about economic development, but I think it's essential, particularly in a state that has experienced such growth over the past couple of decades. I think we need to manage our demand at the same time we look for ways to increase our supply.
Just want to say there was a governor, and I'm not saying which governor, but there was a governor a few years ago that was encouraging people to move to Texas. And I thought at the time, especially these were supposed to be coming from Michigan, I was like, they need to bring their own water with them, Governor, when they come here. And
schools.
Yeah.
But you know, we face
Hospitals.
this growth, and of course it can stop. An economic disaster will stop it. But Houston area right now is approximately 6 million people, and we expect that to be 12 million fairly quickly. They all have to have a road to drive on. They all have to have a place to get their food, and they all have to have a place to get their water. And of course, that's the challenge you live with every day. But the growth, even if it slows, it's still not going to stop, and the issues are still there. So,
Yeah, and I'd say we're starting in a deficit, but every day 1,200 people show up in Texas organically or from other places, and my simple math is they had 135 acre feet need per year, and we're already behind. You know, the math don't lie. And the sad truth is we're probably 10, maybe 20 years, 10 at least, behind that we've got to make up to just get caught up to maintain. As far as the cost goes, you know, per gallon, when you start amortizing some of this stuff out, it gets really pretty affordable. And I say affordable, I mean, you know, a fixed income person, $30 a month is a lot of money. $50 a month is a lot of money. But at the end of the day, that's a philosophical conversation we as a state have to have that, you know, we have to do the things that are absolutely necessary in a way that the average person can afford them. There's a lot of things that we do that we all enjoy and like to do, but are not necessary. So it's a prioritization in some ways. I tell people that water is life. Electricity is quality of life. And I say that with a little bit of tongue in cheek. You got to have power to do waters, right? Be it diesel engines or electricity or wind. But I'm just saying we never have prioritized water in the proper context of just how valuable or how dependent. You know, cities have been built where water supplies are, not where roads and electricity were. Those came after the fact. And so that water supply is going to be the driver going forward for all of the economic conversations. As industries look to Texas, it's beginning to enter into it. As bonding people in New York City are talking to people, they're looking at water and growth, and Texas growth and water don't match up right now. The grid's going to get there. I think people can take confidence that we do fix things. I guess I'm overly confident we're going to address this. And I can read the faces. Y'all can't see them because y'all are looking at me. I see a lot of people out there that's probably been down this conversation 30 years. And I see a lot of ain't happening or he hasn't thought about X. Let me tell you, I've thought about a lot of the X's, and I'm sure there's some to come. But if the state can't get through these X's, of all the reasons why you shouldn't, then I'm looking for property outside the state for my great-grandkids and grandkids to grow up in. It's that serious, and it's the lack of urgency that's got us here. So I want everybody in this room, and when I speak to people, bring your concerns, bring solutions, and let's have a conversation. What I can't have, and I've had this in the past, associations that because there's strong-willed people for different reasons, and I'm a private property rights, let's just set that one aside. I'm going to defend private property rights. Usually you fix private property rights by compensation of some sort. If you can subplant municipal use with a new source and that leaves more in the aquifer for irrigated crop production, that's an in-kind transfer. How much you want to put a value on that? So at the end of the day, we're going to get through these conversations. But if y'all don't see the wisdom in the state leveraging up and putting money towards developing water supply, then that's a whole different conversation, and I don't know how to change your mind, because if anybody is paying attention, none of these projects are going to happen without leverage, and that's how you keep the cost to the consumer down. That's how you reduce the tap. You make someone else that's got a wealth of dollars to supplement. You pay at the pump 25 cents, 20-something cents for roads and bridges in Texas.
On gasoline?
On gasoline.
I think it's more like 40.
Well, that's federal. There's two components in it. So it's not. I'm not advocating for tax increases. I don't think you have to do that with where we're setting as a state. It's a matter of how you put it to work and where it goes to and when it goes to out. But we've got to begin next session, because then it's 27, and then it's 29, and then before then we've added another, million people. And so there's never been a better time to start when you got a surplus. We've had back-to-back blessed surpluses of phenomenal amount. Next session, we have to put the stake in the ground in the water supply fund. That fund was set up not for $250 million. That fund was set up over the next 50 years to churn billions of dollars of projects through it. What that looks like, we got to decide that next session.
Thank you for that. Kind of switching gears here, Senator Johnson, regardless of the cause, the general consensus is that the climate is warming, and we are having more extreme weather events, more extreme droughts, more extreme floods, more extreme wildfires, and hurricanes. These could obviously have impacts to our surface water resources and groundwater resources in the future, and the accuracy of our water planning efforts. Is this something that the legislator should get out in front of, and is it being taken seriously enough, in your opinion?
It's actually my favorite question because it's so good. It covers so many topics. I don't think it's being taken seriously enough. It's a little late to get out in front of it. I agree with Senator Perry. We're kind of already behind. There are some of us who are taking it very, very seriously. And we've taken some steps to address it, but we have to recognize, and in addition to looking at the graph of decreasing water resources, water supplies, other than if you set aside new development and the increasing water demand, we do have an increasingly unpredictable weather patterns resulting in increasingly intense and increasingly unpredictable droughts and floods. And the groundwater is going to be heavily dependent on rainfall and heavily dependent on how much water is pulled out of it during a drought and heavily dependent on population. So it really just highlights everything we've been saying here. You take climate change and layer it on top of everything else, and you have giant triple boldface exclamation point on the mission to increase water resource availability, improve the management of the supply, and get more efficient in our consumption of it. In the political climate right now, I am looking for legislators to kind of just stop. Well, let me just give you an example. You can draw the conclusion. In the Sunset Commission last session, I had a bill to require that the regional water management areas consult with the state climatologist in developing their proposals for the state water plan. And it said they're supposed to talk to them about climate change. And there was this big outcry. You can't say climate change. So I said, okay, extreme weather. Wait, that suggests climate change. You've got to say severe drought and rainfall. Okay, for God's sakes, it's severe drought and rainfall. Did we have to go through this much trouble to address something that is threatening every citizen in this state and our ability to grow in the future? So I think if we can kind of shed some of the silliness around it, and your question says, regardless of the cause, this stuff is happening, I think it's imperative, if we're going to make real progress on this, if we're going to be real serious and commit billions of dollars to what is essentially the most fundamental infrastructural need that we have, we're going to have to not get bogged down in that kind of silliness. I think the people on this stage are serious, and they know it. And I've seen leadership on this stage, but it's a tricky time in politics, and maneuvering some of these initiatives through the legislature will require patience, courage, and skill.
Absolutely. Okay, Senator Kitzman, Representative Kitzman, as previously mentioned, last session was a water session.
It's almost as bad as when somebody called me a congressman one time.
My apologies.
That's smaller than a Senate district.
Yeah, y'all can call me congressman. I think most people in this room would like to keep that momentum going. In your view, how do we keep the focus on groundwater, and what can GCDs and other people in the groundwater community help in that regard?
Well, I think in the end, it's one thing for the people on the committees in the House and the Senate to be focused on those issues. It's another thing to bring the rest of the legislature along with us. And every one of you has a senator and a state representative. Maybe you have more than that. And your relationship with your state representative and with your senators, making sure they understand the issues from your point of view is important. And I'm not saying this as a criticism, but the legislature as a whole kind of looks at the problem of the moment, and that's what they take care of. That's why I was saying earlier, having people in place that keep their hand on the tiller and can keep focused on that is important. But we know that Texas prospers because of water. There's most of Texas, if you went back 150 years, is hostile to settlement because there wasn't any water. I mean, there was places the Comanches didn't even hang out because of water. And but the advent of the windmill and like the air motors that could pump that and opened up vast parts of the state that before were basically uninhabitable. Having your relationship with those elected officials and helping remind them. I don't know that yelling at them does a particularly good job, but talking to them and keeping them and tell them to, have they stopped by and seen Senator Perry lately, or have they stopped by and seen the new chairman of the Natural Resources Committee in the House? I think that would be a big help for us. It's one thing to have a good bill that seems to be common sense. It's another, in the House at least, to get those 76 votes, or perhaps 100 when you have to pass a constitutional amendment, and then, of course, ultimately get that to the governor's desk. And I think, cooperation among some members of the legislature may be easy, getting others to understand that we have to have that big picture view when it comes to water, and it's not just about convenience, it's about our survival.
Absolutely. Senator Perry, last session we saw the formation of the House Water Caucus. Has there been any talk about making it bicameral this session?
Yeah, there has been talk, and I try to set expectations and be as transparent as possible. I'm honestly answering that this way. There's 31 senators. I think I myself have 6 or 8 substantive committees on any given time. Our world in Senate versus 150 House members that are spread out amongst a couple is just limited. So to generate another caucus in the Senate to have a meeting that the senators will not be able to just for sheer scheduling doesn't make sense to me to have staff have to go to that too, because that staff is tied up with my 8 committees on substantive policy conversations ongoing. So it's not a reality in the Senate. That said, I know the House caucus is always open for us to have a person and staff there or have us engaged. If it's possible during the early part of the session, I would try to make those. But it answers it's addressing or trying to address an overall conversation. And someone told me earlier today, there's only one water person left in the chamber, and they pointed to me. And I don't. That's not a compliment. That's a sad statement. I think there's some truth in.
I take a little offense to it,
yeah,
but
exactly, because
I think I'm in the
Nathan
Senate.
here.
I've been on the committee.
But my I guess we do have a void of historical knowledge for sure, and I'll count myself in some of that. That we do have a void in expertise in all the nuance of the statutes, but more importantly, we have a void in people. As long as the tap showed up today and turned on, they don't understand there's a water problem looming and one probably already here. So it's been my kind of focus is to raise awareness, the clanging cymbal in the room. This is something we need to think about. This is something that we need to be very deliberate about. We rely on a plan that's good, but the reliance on a plan that doesn't work is bad. Let's fix the plan so that it works. I mean, so we are limited, I think, on a very small group of people on the legislative side, and really we're dependent upon people in the industry to have these conversations. And so that the idea of another meeting or another scheduled identified group of people that's going to break off and talk, I'd have zero participation, not for lack of desire, but for lack of schedulability. I mean, I always heard that Senate duties were 5 times more than the House duties, and I didn't believe it. But truly, when you're 31 people carrying the same 3,000 bills that are going to have to be dealt with in hearings, not the 8,000 that get filed, but legitimately votes and running through the system over the session, it really does restrict your time for that kind of activity. So I choose not to give some false expectation or premise that we're all into water because we have a water caucus. I think it's great. I think the House is an appropriate place for it. Senate's always engaged, and I have no problem sending a staff to those meetings if they're available.
Well, that's good to hear. Senator Johnson, how do you think GCDs can raise the awareness on groundwater policy issues facing the state?
I think I'll just repeat what Representative Kitzman said, is communication with your representatives and your senators, and probably communication with each other, perhaps more than we've seen, because your collective voice is stronger than your individual voice. We've set it up district by district, which ensures that you've got local representation and that local interests, as differentiated from other places, are heard. But again, I think that you've heard all 3 of us say there needs to be some regional awareness as well as a statewide awareness in developing groundwater, in the use of groundwater. And if you have some combined voices, 1 + 1 is more than 2 very often.
Thank you for that. So we are running short on time. So I do want to talk a little bit about funding before we go. But you're one of the Senator Perry. You were one of the key legislators last session that spearheaded the efforts that was ultimately successful in getting $1 billion of the budget surplus. Talk around capital is there's going to be a lot more this year, maybe upwards of $20 billion. In your mind, if we can get some of that for water, where would you like to see those funds go?
Well, I set up that fund, so I quote Texas Water Supply Fund. It's a bucket underneath Texas Water Development Board, in addition to existing buckets that already exist for rural water SFR funding matches to federal government. So we had water programs in place, and we have the SWIFT fund, and people can argue that that was specifically dedicated to supply fund. What that has become is a very large dollar fund, leveraged, not always grants, but mostly, credit leveraged opportunities where there's 100 millions plus projects that can work through the SWIFT properly. It doesn't help the little guys. It fell short of that. Even though in statute it was, I think, 25% or 20% to ag or something, but it just hasn't made it there. But I went past that and said, until the state actually puts money in to the conversation and starts having the real commitment that people from the outside can look and say, Texas is committed. And so you get money from taxpayers several ways, right? You either get it by a direct assessment at the gas pump or a direct assessment somewhere else, or you get it collected through sales tax of them purchasing and all over the world coming through Texas in our state legislature. So that's where our bulk of our funding is sales tax. I mean, that's the most non-tied up money, if you will. That's discretionary spending. So, but when you have surpluses like this is where you front load the opportunity to move forward and then work out. Without that front load, these projects don't start. So my goal is to fund the Texas water supply bucket that has $250 million from the $1 billion that was out there set aside as a 100% placeholder. $250 won't fund a single desal plant in Texas. But $250 plus earnings, plus legislator, plus cost recovery mechanism yet to be determined on how the state leverages those dollars over the next 50 years does fund every desal opportunity, because there's not a lot of vendors that can absorb more than $1 billion a year, if you will. So my plan is to ask for a commitment of revenue funding. I'm working through the nuance of what that could look like with a jump start into that bucket. So the water supply bucket plus, and probably through negotiations, we need to front load that $750 that we did the other day. We need to put money back in there to continue our infrastructure, because I don't want to build out water supply only to have 140 billion gallons a year go through back to the ground. Arguably, hopefully it ends up back in the groundwater supply, but probably not.
Can I just say that should be easy? 250 and 750, $1 billion that Senator Perry is talking about should be easy. We're talking about, and I keep hearing people say surplus, a $20 billion surplus. This is not a surplus. Surplus is when you have too much food and you can't eat it all. This is unspent money. And either we're collecting too much or we're not using it the right way. That money is there for a use. This is an investment that will benefit every Texan for the next 100 years. We should not be making sure that everybody gets another $23 in property tax relief next session at the expense of $1 billion investment in our water supply.
I agree, and I think this is our time. We have the resource. We have, I believe, a vision. The details of the plan need to be worked through, but we have a general idea of how to do it, and we have to commit to putting the resources there, because we don't get these days very often. Right. We have to be smart going forward on what a recurring revenue stream that's committed to doing this initiative looks like, so that vendors can actually start planning and contracting and moving forward on these initiatives. But shame on us if we leave next session without a substantial commitment to water supply. The grid supply. We put $5 billion into grid to jumpstart the industry, because big dollars. We're talking about another $5 billion. We've got a little bit of schoolwork to clean up, some inflationary costs that they've had to deal with. So we got those issues. The border, honestly, is built into a base budget now that's beyond anybody's comprehension of what we were having to do or will do. Politically, who knows what's going to happen. What I do know today is we need water, and we have money to start that conversation. Yep. I can't handle the uncertainties. We got to do the basics. We got to get back to the basics. That's where I'm at.
Nice. Senator Johnson, where would you like those dollars spent in groundwater?
Oh, in groundwater, and I was just doing my high and mighty overview of we need to spend the money. Specifically, I don't exactly know how to apply it to groundwater. That's what I got. How many people in this room to advise us on the committee? I want to see that we have, I'm particularly interested in capturing excess water from extreme flooding and putting it back into the earth, and in better management. Greater data systems, put some money to the groundwater districts to be able to monitor the groundwater usage. And right now, you've got maybe a $200,000 budget, and you're talking about a system that's going to cost you a tremendous proportion of that. You're not going to make the investment. You're not going to want to levy a tax for it. We've got the money there. So I'd like to see the groundwater districts actually come to us with your financial needs. They're not going to be exorbitant. They're not huge, but help us help the groundwater management districts ensure that we have an adequate supply that's fairly used.
Thank you for that. Rep. Kitzman?
In the end, I think it comes down to you have the tools you need to do your job, and some of that's funding, obviously. Have we provided, it's been indicated, the funding there that you can come to? Do you legislatively in each one of your districts have what you need? It's one thing for someone to say, well, you ought to do this, and then you read your own, legislation that created your district, and you're not allowed to do that. It's not part of who you are, and does that need to be corrected? But then, again, it always comes back to money. Are you able to do that? A large district may have the team that can put together that paperwork. Small district with 3 people in the office or even 2 people in the office may not be able to have that. Are the resources there to help you access what you need? Do you have the tools what you need for your district? And some of that's money, and some of that's just helping you through the process.
Thank you for that. So we have kind of gone over time, but I do want to leave y'all for a few minutes just to summarize what we've been talking about. Any closing remarks? Maybe touch base on something that we didn't discuss that you wanted to bring up. So we'll start with you, Rep. Kitzman.
Well, I do want to thank y'all for having me and letting me participate. It's great to be sitting here with our 2 senators to discuss this. I said before, Texas thrives because of water. And you look at the old maps, and everybody had to build next to a creek or a river or the Gulf, or they just couldn't do what they needed to do. And in today's society, we were able to cover virtually the entire state to engage in whatever activity we care to engage in, whether that's cotton farming or whether that's setting up a nuclear facility to provide electricity for a community, or whether that's data mining or whatever's involved. But it all takes water. Nothing happens without water. And to finally be in a position where I can see that the legislature is actively engaged in working on that problem. It may seem slow. It always seems slow. $1 billion. I don't think that's what the initial request was, but that's what it got paired to. But that left us to another session and another day to bring that issue up and try to make sure it's more adequately funded the next time. We have to talk water every day, and I know you do. That's what you do. It's part of your life. Even if you're on a board and you only meet once a month, you're still out there every day talking to people about water, and they're coming to you and asking you the questions. And I just hope that you never lose that passion and you keep it up, because I think we've got the passion for it, and we just need to spread that around the state. And it's kind of like people that think chocolate milk comes from brown cows. Too many people get to take for granted. They have the luxury of taking for granted where their water comes from, and we know it's a much more serious issue than that. It's much more intimate to you, and I just hope we can continue to provide you what you need and open those doors for you so you can do a better job.
Thank you. Senator Perry?
I think 25 will be an infrastructure session. Last session was higher ed, a little healthcare catch up on some attendant care wages, a lot of different a lot of different things were touched and a lot of good things were done, but I see grid, I hope and expect water. Our roads are doing well because of the way we set them up. Schools, you're going to have the choice bill, the voucher bill passed. So it's going to be, I think, a very narrow session. I don't see a whole lot of massive conversations around major projects. Our window to do the things that people expect. I had someone tell me one time, if I'm in a town hall, people don't ask me about water. And my response was twofold. One, we condition our voters to what to ask for as politicians. If we want property tax relief, there's a beat, and everybody feels property taxes. So when we came to session with that money, and that had been the narrative for a while, and property taxes are high, that was one thing. But I said, there's not 1 in 30 million people that would ever assume, I believe this to my core, would ever assume that Texas would let the lights go out or the taps run dry. They just assume that that's part of the government's role to take sure that that doesn't happen. So when you don't get asked at a town hall about water, it's because they just assume there's always going to be water and the lights are going to come on. And I said, but if you poll that same group that you're in front of, prioritize me funding for water, funding for X, in my district and where I talk to around the state, 90+% will go with water every time. So what's not been heard at the appropriate level of state government is the voice of people that understand the value of water and the need to develop water. And so it's up to you guys and your industry groups and your contacts in your communities to be talking to the elected officials, those people that write checks to political campaigns, that water development, water supply, water-focused session needs to be in 25. If they don't hear, I say they, if the folks that control the legislative agenda, if you will, on some level, doesn't hear that water's important, they're going to assume everybody's happy with the way the water supply works. So it's incumbent upon the narrative and the momentum that we generated last session continue at a very aggressive, respectful, loud way, or nothing changes.
Thank you for that. Senator Johnson, do you?
So real briefly, back to Senator Perry's 1,000 drips. Water is politically more difficult than electricity because with water, you have the water table, your groundwater table going lower and lower and lower. And the lower it gets, doesn't matter. You turn the tap and it still comes on. You're not really aware of the problem. Now, electricity, if something goes wrong, it's out. And we've all experienced it go out. And so there's this great political emphasis on fixing the problem. And we've done some great work, not some not so great work, but really it has the legislature's attention in a way that water has not. And so I think one of the themes here is that we do rely on the groundwater conservation districts and leaders out there in your districts to come to the legislature, to put the emphasis on it, and to help us figure out solutions to the problem.
Thank you. Well, I think we might have time for a question or two. Would anybody like to come up and ask? Looks like we got one contestant.
It's water related. So there's a lot happening in the Permian Basin with well blowouts and overpressurized injection wells, and those are putting water supplies for ranchers, farmers, and communities out there at risk. New zombie wells keep popping up and hitting the news. And Senator Perry, you've expressed concern that, water supply, if you're investing in a property, you want to make sure there's going to be a water supply in the future. So what our laws are allowing these sort of things to happen, and because inactive wells, they can remain unplugged because we have unlimited well plugging extensions, and then as these wells are aging, they are at higher risk of failing, and then blowouts are also happening because of poor oversight at the Railroad Commission with allowing too much injection. And these are the things that are causing the blowouts in the Permian. But I think this is also a broader problem for the whole state, specifically around the orphaned and inactive wells that we just aren't plugging, because if they fail, they can affect the water quality in a lot of these in all these groundwater districts for our communities. So is this something that's on y'all's radar, something that y'all are thinking of doing anything about this session? Kind of.
So to summarize, is the state dealing with orphaned and abandoned wells in the oil and gas industry? The answer to that is yes. We as a legislature have funded a large amount of money to go out and address some of it. But I will tell you, as a major umbrella, orphaned wells are by their nature differently jurisdictionally. So if they're old hydrocarbon, then that's a Railroad Commission issue. If they're old water, that's kind of sort of a TCEQ mixed orphaned well. But specifically to your question, the federal government actually threw some money down to start some of that. We've threw some money down. Surprisingly enough, the money's a large number, right? I mean, we know there's thousands of these out there in the field. Most of them, fortunately, are not contributors to a big problem, but some are very visible and some are contributing to the problem. But that said, we funded all that the contractor community can actually do, meaning we put enough in there to satisfy going out and fixing X wells. If we put any more money in there, there's not enough vendor support. So we're working through it. Does it need more attention? Yes. Is it getting more attention because of seismic activity, because of some other things of recent, because of federal government's interest in it? Yes. So we're working through it. It's just going to take a list because we didn't get here overnight. Those wells have been out there since the 50s.
So I guess my question is actually a little bit more related to the inactive wells that are on the books for companies. There's like 114,000 of those, and they are at risk of being orphaned and becoming our problem for taxpayers. And that's like 9,000 wells.
So it's the same conversation.
That's
It's the same group, and here's the problem. As time goes on, if those were independent wildcatter operators back in the 40s, 50s, 60s, they're gone. And there wasn't a bonding requirement left that was going to make them fit that. So as time goes on, your majors that have great records that go back to the dark 30 days when they bought that back in the 1900s or the 1800s, they have record of who owns it. So first of all, whose responsibility is it? If they're existing today, fix it. If they're not existing today, then the state and the feds partner up to fix it. So it's not as easy as it sounds. You don't go out and say, that's an orphan well, I'm going to fix that. You find out whose well is that, whose responsibility was that, and who should be funding the fix of that. If it's a major like a Chevron or Exxon or XTO or whatever, if it's one of theirs and you can prove it's theirs, they come back and fix it. So we're working on it. That's all I can say.
come talk to you later.
Gentlemen, you asked us to come to you with solutions, and while I was sitting here, one popped in my head to make this session focus on water. Perhaps you can talk to the superintendent at the Capitol, and that first week of the legislature, you could make the water go off for the whole day. So a day without water at the Capitol.
Very practical
focused
man.
Everyone's attention.
I'll go one further. The one below freezing date during section that we'll have, please don't run the sprinklers.
I just had a quick question about desal. Y'all were talking about sources being marine produced water and brackish. And it's my understanding that some of the folks on the coast are talking about desal and then just putting that high saline content right back into the ocean, which is going to completely destroy the ecosystems of the Gulf. So I'm wondering if in this, drinking water conversation, there's also this wastewater management consideration.
So to be clear, let's make sure we understand. Nobody sets up a desal today and starts shoving salt back out in the sea. That's not how that works. The one that's currently predicted to go into construction is currently in Corpus. It has went through at least 6 years of regulatory compliance conversations that assures and guarantees that the discharge from a desal will be far enough out into a current that it diffuses itself and does not work, does not harm the environment. So there's this perception, and it's just like everything we do. If I mention nuclear, the first people think is 3 Mile Island and it's going to kill everybody. You got to get past that. The technology's evolved. I'll give you Israel, probably 85, 90% of their supplies desal from the Mediterranean. They've been doing it since the 90s. They're leaders in it. They're forefronts in it. I've seen the plants, 90 million gallons a day. And to date, they have not had a single environmental issue discharging their discharge back into the Mediterranean because they figured out where currents and size and things were to make sure that happens. Can it happen? Is it a problem? Absolutely, if you're not doing it responsibly. Is it something we need to be extremely serious about? Yes. The permit was approved for Corpus in 18. Citizens raised the issue that it's going to be discharging inside of the port, I think it was, just too close inside and not far enough out. Fast forward to 25, there are now permits approved at the federal level. They're pushing it further out. So the key is do it responsibly, do it what science says is okay and determined. And if you believe that our oceans are rising because of melting ice caps, then a little salt probably is going to balance it back out over time. I don't know. But I'm just saying it is a valid concern. It is one that I think that the data and the marine biologists and everybody involved in that conversation is aware of, and they believe, and history has borne this out in countries that have been doing it for a long time, that you can do it responsibly. So,
Thanks.
All right, I think that's the end of the questions. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us here today.